Okay, welcome everyone to this open talk. My name is Karin Bradley and I'm an associate professor at the Department of Urban Planning and Environment, KTH. And here with us is Kirsty Hobson. We are very glad that you're here. And you are a reader in human geography from Cardiff University. And Kirsty is here to give this talk, but she's also here to be the faculty opponent tomorrow of a PhD thesis called Scaling Sufficiency that Ola Persson has written. And your research deals with the social and ecological transformation, particularly in the fields of sustainable production and consumption. And you've been doing quite a lot of research, particularly on the circular economy agenda. So that is something that interests many of us. And today you will talk then on the topic of on the paradox of the circular consumer. Kirsty will talk around 30 minutes or so, and then there will be time for questions. And please engage, both you in the room and you on Zoom as well. You can pose questions on the Q&A function. Okay, so.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for that very thorough introduction. Hello, everybody. It's really nice to be here. And hello, people on Zoom. I can't see you, but I'm just assuming you're there somewhere. So yes, I'm from the School of Geography and Planning at Cardiff University, from Wales. That will be significant later. So just so you know that we are not part of England. We are actually a separate country. People get that wrong, including the taxi driver yesterday who asked me which part of England Wales is in. Anyway, so that's what I'm talking about today. And now it won't change slides. All right, so what is a paradox? Why did I say circular consumer and paradox? So I've got to stop walking. I walk a lot when I talk, and I know I'm going to disappear off camera over there, so somebody tell me off. I'm sure you know what a paradox is, but I'm just going to explain, take this definition so we're all on the same page. What a paradox is a logically self-contradictory statement, or a statement that runs contrary to one's expectations. So it's a statement that, despite apparently valid reasoning from true premises, leads to a seemingly self-contradictory or a logically unacceptable conclusion. What I want to talk about today is why I think this idea of the consumer within the circular economy amounts to pretty much what is a paradox, by which it is an unacceptable conclusion to what is a major problem. But I want to go back to basics and go back to this definition. And it says, it's a statement of apparently valid reasoning. What is the apparently valid reasoning behind this idea of the circular consumer? Now, I'm going to go back to basics here, and I apologize. Probably everybody in the room and on Zoom knows a lot of this stuff already, but I can't assume that you do. So I'm just going to go very quickly through some basic stuff. I know you probably know what the circular economy is, but obviously it's that idea, it's that framework of going from linear to more sort of circular routes in terms of retaining value within the economy. So rather than getting something, using it and dumping it, we find ways to reuse, to repair, to remanufacture, etc. And it has become, I started looking at issues of the circular economy about a decade ago. So I was working on Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council project on mobile phones. And at that point in time, it was still resource efficiency was the term. The circular economy was only just starting to be used in policy circles. That was only a decade ago. And when I spoke to people, even people in the field, about the circular economy, they tended to kind of blink a lot and wonder what I was talking about. But here we are 10 years on, and we have the European Union, European Commission, Circular Economy Action Plan. Canada has just, that's what this is here, have brought out their Turning Point report about the circular economy within Canada. We have Chinese government doing various things for a long time. We have Amsterdam, and I could go on. So in that time, there has been a really noticeable rise in this idea that the circular economy as a framework is going to be really, really useful from a policy and an intervention perspective. And as a researcher, we can't ignore that fact. So that's what I've been thinking about for about a decade now. And again, you may be familiar with this diagram, but just so we know what we're talking about, this is a very common representation of the circular economy from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And it's trying to capture the various pathways. And we're going to be thinking a bit more as I go on about these different pathways. So I tend to think over this part of the butterfly, as it's called, not so much over the green side, but over the blue side, thinking about the user and the consumer. So repairing, reusing, remanufacturing, and recycling. And the idea, the sort of basic premise here is that the smaller the loops, the more circular the sort of resource retention of the value is. So this has become a very popular representation of the circular economy, and that turns up time and time again. And I think we can take this as the received notion of what a circular economy should look like from a kind of European Union perspective. So coming back to the consumer, this is us here going about our business, and we are very, very important to the circular economy. All the arrows go towards and then away from us. So you would think, like 10 years ago, I was thinking, wow, look at this, like this is all about the consumer. This is really interesting. And then went looking for the consumer within policy documents and found us basically missing in action. There wasn't a lot being said about who and what these individuals were. So I found that very curious. Why is it that we're not being spoken about in a very thorough way? What role are we being asked to play in all of this? I'll come on to a bit more of that in a minute. So we have this narrative of the circular economy that suggests it's actually quite a neat process. It's this idea that we can retrofit the economic systems that we have now to fit that framework, to fit more like that. But actually, we have everything in place in terms of society and politics. Yeah, maybe we need some altered policies, but actually, we're more than able to start altering the loops and making the economy more circular with the kind of socio-political status quo as it is. And the assumption has very much been that the user and the consumer within this framework acts like the archetypal consumer. That is, when you're going out shopping, if you've got this product to choose from, which isn't very circular, and this one that is a lot more circular, we can come back to what that might mean for various products. You as a consumer will be informed and enlightened, and you'll pick the more circular one. And that will be caused either by price or by your values or by your models. So it's a very common story of the green consumer or the eco-consumer, which we've heard now for decades. So that assumption that with the right price signals or some moral enlightenment, you and I will start to choose differently. And by choosing differently and behaving differently, we will be a key part of the circular economy. But it's not just about what we buy, it's also about how we tend to and care for the stuff that we have. So there's been a lot of work around repair and reuse. And generally, when you talk to people about the circular economy, a lot of the research that comes out around this is very optimistic about whether you and I can actually become active agents within bringing about that kind of circularity, that you and I can actually keep consuming, but consume in ways and actually bring down the resource use. Because fundamentally, that is the bottom line, that is what we are aiming for. And the question as to whether the circular economy can achieve that is something, again, we'll come back to. But when I talk to a lot of researchers and policymakers and students, what we hear is that there are very good reasons to be optimistic. There is a valid reasoning that we in the global north, and that's the kind of we that I'm talking about here, it's a very different picture in different countries, That actually we're starting to get it. We consume a bit differently these days. You know, we're a bit greener, we're a bit more aware about climate change. So actually, we can be very optimistic and hopeful that at some point the penny will drop and we'll play our part in shifting towards a circular economy. And so there are bits of information you can pick out that suggest there's good reason for that level of optimism. So there was an interesting report that came out by LE Europe pre-pandemic, and it was actually a multi-country study looking at consumer perceptions of the circular economy across European countries. I think it was 10 countries, but they talked to quite a large number of members of the public about what they did and what they think. And that study showed that actually people were saying, I would like to engage more. I've heard about the kind of ideas of circularity. I mightn't have heard of the particular phrase, but I get what you're talking about in terms of the circular economy. But the engagement was low. So people repair products. Maybe you have, you know I have a go at repairing some things at home, so I would be in that 64%. But not many people are renting or leasing or buying secondhand. So that kind of sharing economy and the reusing has not really been hitting home. But if one wanted to take a particular reading of that finding, you could say, well, that's hopeful. There's the understanding, there's the wish. We just need to get people into action. But of course, we've been here before, and you'll probably all know very well about the value action gap. That, you know, I'm been researching this topic for 20 years now, and pre-circular economy, you know, sustainable development, green economy, we've had various iterations of what turns out to be fundamentally a very similar model of social change, which is information, prices, build it and they will come, basically. And so the more one sort of digs deeper into this, you get that feeling that actually, is this what the circular economy for the consumer really is? Has anything really changed in our understanding of the roles that you and I play within this particular model? So that's it's a genuine question. And so you could read that and say, well, you know, there's hope, but also we have to think about, well, how do we get people from I've heard of repairing to actually repairing? And of course, you can look at quite sort of big picture quantitative stats like the sharing economy, the global sharing economy predicted to increase significantly by 2025 from $15 billion in 2014. But again, if we dig behind that story, we can think about the moves towards like the privatizing of the sharing economy in terms of all the big controversies over like Airbnb. You know, can we actually say that Airbnb is sharing economy? No, we can't. Can we say that Uber is? No, we can't. It's all like privatization of what did start as sharing platforms. So even behind that story, there's a reason to kind of be slightly cautious. And I'm saying all this because these are what gets sort of thrown out to me as a researcher a lot of times, saying, well, look, you know, we've got the makings here of the circular consumer. And I always think, well, hold on a second, is it actually that possible? And of course, I don't need to tell you this, resource use continues to grow. So while we're all learning about the circular economy and thinking, oh, well, I have heard about repair, still resource use goes up. So what is going wrong? Is it too early or too soon to know if the circular economy can be effective? Am I like just really impatient here? Do I have to give the circular economy time for people to learn about repair, for people to learn about reuse, and give us 20 years and we'll be there? Well, if you look at what's happening around the world, we probably don't have 20 years to get there. So maybe it's not that. Maybe we just need to work harder on persuading people and getting more circular consumer options out there. Or maybe we've not got the right policy mix. There's a very good argument to be made for that, and I certainly would make that argument as well. Interestingly, I just saw that there's a House of Lords report come out with the Climate Change Committee. Yes, today is Thursday, isn't it? Yes, yesterday, about behaviour change, basically saying that what is happening in the UK, well, a lot of what's happening in the UK is terrible, but what the government is doing is never going to get people to change their behaviour because it's completely scattergun and inadequate. So the Climate Change Committee is saying we actually really need to have a focused look at behaviour. So that's very interesting, that that's actually starting to really hit home. But of course, the House of Lords and the Climate Change Committee are not the House of Commons, where it's where the real power sits. So we'll have to see what happens with that. But definitely we haven't got the policy mix right. Or maybe it's something else and all of the above. You know, that means why is the resource use still going up, and yet everyone's getting very excited about the circular economy? I also want to suggest that one of the things that we are getting wrong collectively is that the circular economy, if you go back to that diagram, it's suggesting a system. So really, if I go back and sorry, hold on, bear with me. So that really is a system level diagram that we can think about this not only from a social perspective, but from an ecological and an economic perspective. You can map onto this very systemic thinking. But actually, even though the language of systems is used, when you look at most of what goes on around the circular economy, practice and change and research, particularly in my own field where you're looking at behavior change, it very often looks at one product. Like how do consumers react to this new product service system, rather than necessarily taking a step back and thinking about that service system within a bigger picture. So it tends to think more about singular value chains and products. So yes, you can make one company and one phone and one thing more efficient, you can make it more circular, you can make it greener. What about all the other parts of that system it's embedded in? This is nothing new. We've talked about systems thinking for decades, but it's really very, very sort of clear when you look at a lot of the research and policy that hasn't sunk through. Very much thinking about one bit of circularity at a time, but of course it has knock-on effects within a system. And one of my favorite papers that I like to drag out is the Zink and Gaia paper from 2017, which was talking about rebound effects within the system of the circular economy. And basically saying that actually all of this is great, but if what is coming back around in those loops is not replacing virgin material, if it's adding on top instead of replacing it or displacing it, we've missed the point. And currently the global economy has a 9% displacement value, which basically means that of the material that's getting used, only 9% of it comes from recycling or remanufacturing. We are a long, long way off. I think it's 12% across Europe. So how can we, or can we even get that percentage higher? It's a genuine question. And it functions across scales as well. We all might do it ourselves. I know I moved house in April, and I got slightly obsessed with Etsy at one point, like all the kind of like upcycled hipster stuff you can buy. And then I thought, hold on, am I buying something because instead of going to IKEA, or am I buying it just because it's hipster and it looks funky? And I wasn't displacing my own consumption, and I had to stop myself, but we all do it. So it's that idea of that sort of something taking over from something else. And the rebound effect, I bang on about this no end. People treat the notion of rebound like it's sort of a hangover after a good night out. It's actually part of a system of consumption that we often underestimate. So I assume you know what a rebound is. It's basically that if something becomes an object or a system becomes more efficient, we tend to use more of it. That's a direct rebound. An indirect is you save money by making your household more efficient in terms of energy heating, and with that money, you fly off to Tenerife for a week. That's an indirect rebound effect. So basically, the savings that you make when you look at a singular system or a singular product actually isn't capturing the other knock-on effects within that system. And it's very, very evident in consumer behavior. So there's some interesting work. Smartphones, reuse smartphones, rather than buying a new one, you get a refurbished and reused one. About a third of the emissions saved are raised by rebound effects. I was also reading a paper about leasing boats, which you would think, okay, but still, there was some very clear rebound effect for people who were leasing rather than buying their own boat, to the point where it actually wiped out all the savings in terms of resources. And you might think, okay, well, a third of emissions saved. We're talking about, sorry, that's emissions, we're not talking about resources per se. So the work on the rebound shifts between resources and emissions. You might think, okay, well, 2/3 of emissions have been saved. That's okay, that's good. But the thing is, as consumption keeps ramping up, so do that 2/3. So on absolute levels, the emissions are still going up quite significantly, even though you're still saving a third, because we haven't pulled in our consumption. And if you're interested, so I know you probably can't see that, it's really tiny. This paper just came out, and it's all about, so it's Castro et al. In the Journal of Cleaner Production. I've got the reference at the end, which I can share with you. This is a great paper on rebound effects within the circular economy. It's one of those papers I think, damn, I wish I'd written that paper, because it just really nicely captures, in this table here, captures all the different ways in which circularity is actually problematic in terms of rebound effect. So I won't go into it anymore, so you can have a look at that paper just to highlight what we're talking about. So what I'm trying to say, coming back to my original point, is I'd argue that the valid reasoning for the circular consumer is based on fundamentally flawed premises. And these are premises that actually keep coming up time and time again in this narrative we have of this consumer in the modernity. So I've got a quote here from a report I read, and there's quite a lot of, it's interesting who is inhabiting the circular consumer space. So there is a lot of sort of private consultancies getting involved in coming up with the messaging and encouraging investment within circular business opportunities. But of course, what that is then doing is privatizing the kind of social good around any notions of circularity, but it's also re-embedding this idea of what a circular consumer is. So here's one of those reports. Only by making this transition as frictionless as possible for consumers will companies encourage mass engagement with circular practices and succeed in capturing all the gains on offer from circular models. Gains probably means profit. I'm pretty sure it does in this particular quote. But isn't that interesting language? Frictionless for the consumer. So we're talking about a kind of continuation and a ramping up of hyper consumerism, where for you it is seamless to keep consuming. For us all, it's seamless to keep consuming. And the question is, can we actually really keep condoning that model of the consumer within a circular economy that might possibly deliver anything in terms of resource saving? Critical scholarship says no. For the circular economy to do anything, it has to radically alter our core socio-material relationships. So it's not about frictionless consumption, it's about causing lots of friction within the system to actually make us question and slow down our own consumption. So it's about how we relate to objects and each other and society. I know that's a lot to say, and it is. So one of the things I've been thinking about recently is, what is the economy in the circular economy? Because really, most of what gets talked about is the circles, not the economy. I'm not the first one to make that point. It's not a massive revelation, but when you sit and think about it, it actually reveals a lot more about the narratives than the circles do. So the circular economy proponents very readily accept the economist version of what the economy is. So it's about meeting needs, it's about expressing preferences, it's about nudging towards consumer sovereignty. But what I want to do is just pause and think about the role of consumption in the whole of society. It isn't just about meeting needs, it isn't just about consumer sovereignty. I don't know if any of you have read Carbon Democracy by Timothy Mitchell. It's one of those books that I read and have never forgotten. Kind of changed my life, if I can say that. It's basically mapping how the ways in which we have extracted energy from coal to gas, etc., has actually made forms of politics possible. I'll give you a very good example. The miners' strike in the UK in the 1980s, 1984, I'm old enough to remember it. Margaret Thatcher squashed the unions in the UK because the coal mines were a source of mass labour. And that labour could shut down the UK pretty quickly by going on strike, and that's what happens. And eventually all the mines were closed, the people lost their jobs, the unions were squashed. So what Mitchell is saying is actually, we tend to think we've got the economy, and then we've got energy, and we've got politics, and we've got society, but actually they're all inextricably linked. I'm saying that because I say the same for consumption. And these books here, The Making of Consumer Culture, if we go back, consumption is part of the historical and deeply embedded social contract of citizenship in the global north, in particular since World War II. And we forget that. And I think there's a historical perspective that needs to come into these stories of the circular economy to show that actually it's not a case of just tinkering with a few resource circles. Actually, consumption has become a kind of socio-political norm that it's like a deal, basically, that we've had since World War II. We pay our taxes, we get the welfare state, we behave ourselves, most of us behave ourselves, and for that, we're allowed to go out and consume and do what we want with our spare money. That is not incidental. I would argue that is a fundamental social contract to how society functions. Sweden, Britain, a lot of places. So what the circular economy fundamentally should be doing is renegotiating that social contract. Very easy for me to stand here and say that. I know it's bonkers, really, but I don't think it's wrong, because if you say to people, you need to stop consuming, some might, but most say no, because I need this, I want that, why should I when they're not? The sense of equality and inequality, looking at the uber wealthy and what they're allowed to get away with, very hard to actually see how we get to resource reduction, radical resource reduction, through a kind of voluntarist, because we expect to be able to spend our money on what we want to. And if we look at what happened during the pandemic, we'll see the repercussions of not being allowed to do that. I always remember the first day I went back to work and the shops opened in Cardiff. The queue to Primark was down the high street. It was about a mile long. People wanted to get back into the shops. That's fine. I'm not judging that, but I'm just saying that that was the freedom that people wanted to experience, was the freedom to shop. So there are certain levels and types of consumptions, my final point here, that are necessitated for participation in modern life. Going out to work, thinking of Juliet Schul's work, if you're familiar with that, in terms of the work spend cycle. We want to work, we go out to work, we're busy, we buy lunch is there, it's convenience wrapped up. So there's a whole kind of modes of consumption wrapped up in modernity. And our perception of our rights, as I've said already, is very much around this freedom. So I'm just mindful of the time. This is my last slide. No, it's not, because it won't change. There we go. Okay, that's, as I say, that's very easy for me to say. But where does that leave the circular economy, and where does that leave us as researchers? As I say, it's all very well and good. I mean, I'm sure you've all been to conferences where people say, oh, we need society to change, we need values to change. You think, okay, that's great, but how do we actually do that? But I'm very clear in my own commitment now that the inherent systemic and socio-political norms mean that the circular consumer will, in its current iteration, I'm not saying there's no hope, I'm not saying there's no optimism, but where we look for the hope and optimism isn't necessarily where we might find it in terms of this change. But as it stands within those mainstream discourses and models, it's not really going to deliver much in terms of bringing down energy and resource use, because it's still within that background noise of it's my right to consume. And I've just been writing a paper with a colleague at Wageningen University, and we were talking about the R hierarchy. So, well, it depends actually. There's lots of different R hierarchies, which is basically all the way down from, you refuse something, then you reuse it, then you repair it, then you remanufacture it, then blah, blah, blah. So there's all these R's down to the bottom, which actually recycling is usually the worst one. And people are saying we need to have refuse, so don't consume, at the top one. But again, I think I've made this point already, that actually implies quite a lot of constraint on individuals' parts to refuse to consume. And we're putting the burden of responsibility onto people to tell them you need to stop consuming when you're surrounded by no end of consumption. So I have a real problem with that idea of putting refuse at the top of the R hierarchy, because I think it has a moral imperative which is a bit unfair. So we as researchers are very good at theorizing all of this. There's loads of work on degrowth and sufficiency economy, and it's all great. But where do we go from here? So I'm going to finish off talking a little bit about where I'm at with this. So this is, and I told you Wales was going to come back in. This is the Welsh Government's Beyond Recycling stance framework at the moment. So Wales, small country, there's about 3 million of us. And we have the third highest domestic recycling rate in the world. The Welsh Government is very proud of that, as we should be. But now they've realised, and it's great, that actually we need to go, as the words say, beyond recycling. And so I've been talking to some of our policy people in the Welsh Government, and I'm very fortunate to be in Cardiff, which is the capital of Wales. The Welsh Government is there, and they are literally, just down the road. We can pop and I, go and have coffee with them. It's really great. And they're very open to talking to researchers. So they've got a very informed view of what's going on. But I've been talking to some of them about repair and reuse. They're very much like, okay, we've got the recycling. How do we now get people repairing and reusing? What they want for me to help them with is to think about the value action gap. How do we jump over that? When I say to them, you can't, but actually we need to think about how people might perceive them being asked to repair something in a country of growing inequality, cost of living crisis, and uber wealthy people getting away with not paying their taxes. How do we actually frame repair in that context, rather than just like, just come along and learn a new skill? Some people want to, but they're the people who are going anyway. How do you actually take the people who aren't going and doing repair with you? And my question is, how does one talk to policymakers about these really deep issues when they want a more superficial response? They're not superficial people. I'm not saying anything bad about the Welsh Government. I think they're doing brilliant work. But this is what I'm trying to, and I'd be really happy for you to help me think this through. How do we talk degrowth and sufficiency in a realistic way to policymakers so they don't go down that path of thinking build it and they will come? That's where I'm at the moment with talking to the Welsh Government. So I've run out of time. I will finish there. Those are some of the papers that I've quoted. What's the circular economy? Oh yeah, the rebound effects. Yeah, that's the Markov paper is the rebound effect paper, and that's me there. And please feel free to email me at any point. But now I'll stop and we can have questions.
Hey, thank you so much. Super interesting, and particularly this last question. I think that's something that perhaps some of you others in the room are also struggling with. So the word is open. So just wave your hand, I'll put you on the list. But whilst you're thinking, I can start up with a question. I think when you mentioned this, only 9% of flows are circular. There was a recent report made on Sweden on the this circularity gap report. You probably know those, yeah. That pointed out that in Sweden it's only 3%.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah, so even less, 3% of the flows are circular, sort of. So, but that has been, from what I've seen, very little debated publicly. It's still sort of an idea of we can push this circular economy and things will be solved and we can have renewable energy and then we can consume as before. But given those figures, how do you have any comments on how policymakers respond to that? Because even if you can, there are reasons to push the circular sort of economy, you still need somehow to then reduce resources. I mean, make the loops slower, so to say. Or
I mean, I'm just coming back to the Welsh government again. Sorry, I'm not going to go on about Wales non-stop, but I'm just thinking of their response has been to actually start to invest within the business to business rather than the business to consumer. So actually trying to get businesses, helping them. Okay, let me start again. If you're a business and someone says, do you want this pure, this virgin material that's 100% effective, or do you want this remanufactured, recycled? A lot of businesses saying, well, no, I don't want the remanufactured, for a lot of reasons that people also don't want to buy reused stuff because they think like it's not going to be as effective or it's not going to be as sparkly new. One of the things the Welsh government has done is to work with businesses to actually change their approaches and actually the equipment they use to use remanufactured goods within their actual process. So it takes serious investment. In a small country, that's probably more possible, like Wales, 3 million people. How many people in Sweden?
10.
Okay, bigger country, probably more difficult to do in terms of actually mapping the businesses. But that has been quite useful in terms of working with the businesses within Wales to start to see remanufactured and recycled goods as feasible resource feed into their business models. So it can happen, but I think it takes for the penny to drop how important this is. And I think that could be the barrier in terms of actually fundamentally realizing, because some people think, oh, well, we're still recycling quite a lot, so doesn't it all somehow come out in the wash? There's kind of quite fuzzy thinking about where the resources go. That's just,
Thanks. Other comments or questions?
No.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, one comment and then one question. Yes, the last question about how to address policymaker. I heard, I don't remember who, but someone saying that perhaps it can be easier to talk about reduced consumption than reduced economical growth. That could be a better starting point, or at least less political powerful something. So that could be one way. I was thinking. And then the question, I was thinking about this displacement, the substitution. I mean, I agree with that there's a risk that it will like develop on top rather than substitute. And it's also quite tricky because, I mean, it's not enough that I buy a second-hand T-shirt instead of a new one, but it also needs to avoid the production of the new T-shirt, because if it's still production, or but although I avoid or make the decision to not buy a new one, but I buy a second-hand, but it's still a production, and there's also resource extraction, then I mean, it needs to go all the way to actually be environmentally beneficial.
Yeah.
So, but my question, but I also think it's very it's really complex. I mean, this displacement issue. So I was more thinking like how to actually reach through displacement, like how to, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question, and I don't think we've even started to fully understand its dynamics. So if you think about like the rebound effect, for example, which is part of displacement, or non-displacement happening, the research around consumer rebound effects is really patchy because it's very hard to know. Most of the work done is about domestic energy use, because you can look at that, you can look at the bills, you can get a reading, you can say, okay, in, out, whatever. And there is work done with consumers. There was one paper that I was looking at that was talking about particular methodology of working out, but how could you find out from people themselves? Okay, so you bought that secondhand T-shirt. Did you then go and buy something else because of that? Like, how many of us would actually be able to answer that truly? Because we don't even consciously necessarily think like that. So actually even finding the rebound effect and displacement within the consumer practice is actually really, really hard to locate. So we're going off a lot of, there is data there, but it's patchy. But the assumptions that we're making are that it's probably going on a lot more than we realize, but we're only sort of semi-conscious of it ourselves. And how do you talk to people about it without it sounding patronizing and moralizing? You know, don't go and buy that T-shirt. It makes us extremely uncomfortable, again, because it's a fundamental right. You can tell other people what to do in their own private homes with their expendable income. We can't do that, but we kind of have to. So how are we actually going to do that? So yeah, absolutely, displacement is a fundamental issue with the circular economy that you just do not hear spoken about much. When you've got the circularity gap reports, which is about displacement to some degree, but that tends to be at the meta industrial sort of level, not so much at the consumption level. So yeah, I've been trying to get some funding to do more research on domestic circular economy displacement and rebound, and it's not successful so far.
First, we had a question. Then
yes, yeah. Actually, two questions from our Zoom attendees.
Oh, right.
I don't know if you take one or
we'll just take one.
Try both of them. Yeah, so Cecilia asks, what importance do you assign to language use for change to occur, especially the use of the word consumers instead of other words such as citizens?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's funny though, in terms of how, from a critical scholarship perspective, we tend to sort of bristle a bit at calling people consumers. But actually, for a lot of people, that's a very positive identity. That it is a source of freedom, it is a source of identity, it is a sort of expression, that's the word I'm looking for. It's a form of expression. It's a space in which they feel comfortable being able to be themselves. So I do appreciate that actually talking about citizens rather than consumers actually is, it has a sort of moral or ethical basis which feels a lot sturdier, but it also can be quite alienating for a lot of people for whom actually consumption is very important because they've grown up in a society which has told them it's very important. So we're getting into kind of deep psychological change here about people almost like questioning the fundamental values of their own society. So that's not really an answer, but I mean, obviously language matters significantly. I'm not a sort of semiotics analyst, but we can think about how people react to degrowth. For example, I was talking to the Welsh government, should not have used the word degrowth because like it was headlights, you know, just the alarm bells. I could literally hear the alarm bells going off when I said that word. And I thought, oh, note to self, never say degrowth to a policymaker ever again. They didn't like it. But if you talk about sufficiency and well-being, that's a whole other conversation, because sufficiency equals resilience equals citizenship. So it all comes into this kind of nice, warm feeling of people doing their bit for society. So it does definitely matter, yes.
Okay, then Pernilla.
So you talked about the domestic aspects of this, but also the notion of displacement on different levels is something that comes back. You can talk about Wales with certain regulations and understandings and room for investment, and then the UK, or we talk about Europe or the global perspective. And I think here is also an issue with how we understand the circular economy in terms of is it displacing on the local economic arena, or the regional or domestic, or is it displacing further down the lines or global production? And how will we be able to engage policymakers on these different levels? Have you thought or looked at that? Because I think there's a lot of circular washing on the local, regional, national, even then agenda. But then you talk to, so I've debated this with the Swedish Industry Association. Their interpretation of circular economy is, of course, a free trade global market. When we talk about circular economy, it's understanding local, regional, national communities. So it would be interesting to hear sort of your observations on that, discussing policy at these different levels.
Well, I think you pretty much already said it, really, in terms of, circular economy has become like sustainable development, has become like the green economy. It's become a bit of an empty signifier in many ways. It's almost too late. But that doesn't mean that we all can't work with those possibilities that are coming up through the circular economy framework and divert them into different directions, like working with the Welsh government. It would be too easy for me to say, oh, the Welsh government, they don't get it, and just another greenwashing, circular washing, and sort of walk away with a copy of Das Kapital under my arm, to be angry. But I don't think that's helpful. So it's more about that. But I would agree, like at a global level, I've read so many reports by the kind of people that Ellen MacArthur Foundation deal with, these huge corporations who are circular washing, absolutely. And I don't think there's anything much you and I could possibly do about that. The fact that Coke is now legitimately sponsoring the next COP is just shameful. So yeah, I don't know. I've got anything else to add to what you already observed, really.
Yeah, another one.
Yes. Okay, we have another good question soon. Elizabeth, she's asking, how do you see the ongoing energy crisis helping us on the way to reduce consumption and recycle more by simply making people less prosperous?
That's a very tricky question, and unfortunately, who suffers the most? It's not the prosperous. I don't know what inequality is like now in Sweden, but in the UK, it's pretty dire. It's getting worse. The people who need to be brought up to basic levels of well-being, level of consumption, are the ones that are going to suffer the most. I don't think it helps us at all, really, because the people who can afford their bills will pay their bills and they'll be fine. And also what happens when inequality grows. Another book that really sort of changed my life was The Spirit Level. I don't know if you've read yet, by Wilkinson and Pickett, and it talks about the effect that inequality has on society. And so with the energy crisis, you'll see a more polarization of inequality, and with that, everything else gets worse. crime, educational outcomes, job opportunities, people's perception of the environment gets worse. So I don't see it as anything but bad, to be honest with you.
Yeah, please. Oh, sorry.
You
Yes,
you
first.
you did,
Sorry,
yes.
sorry. Yeah, so first you. Yeah, yeah.
I just speaking of you mentioned Coca-Cola,
Yeah.
and I had been thinking during your talk. So when recycling was first introduced as a concept, it was because of after the plastics revolution, Coca-Cola in fact wanted to not use glass. It's more resource intensive. It's more expensive to them. And early extended producer responsibility schemes were installed in many places to deal with the fact that now you're producing something that's meant to be thrown away. But then Coca-Cola really pushed recycling as this idea of let's put it on the consumer. Like how can we make the consumer responsible for us making all this stuff? And obviously there's something kind of deeply wrong with that victim blaming in some ways. But interestingly, today we can recycle plastics, and it's almost like dream it and then you do it. Like for most of plastic recycling history, it was kind of a myth, but now it's possible and it's happening more and more. And I guess if that gets applied to circular economy, and we can admit that it's more of a spiral economy at the moment, or it's just getting bigger, but there's sort of some return and maybe it could be good. To what degree, and here's my question, to what degree should we make consumers believe that circular economy is happening, can happen, is good? Or to what degree should the efforts be more disbelief, realize that it's not quite where it needs to be, and that will manifest, future. Like, do we manifest through belief, even if it's not effective, or do we kind of get people the information they need about how ineffectual it is in the hopes that will drive better change?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I was thinking about recycling. So again, I'm sort of old enough to remember the days before we had extensive municipal recycling in the UK, and it was a pain you had to like take your bags down to the local tip. I mean, we did it, but you had to do that. You had to make an effort. And now it's everywhere, and that's great. But there's also some very interesting work about what that then does to our perceptions and that idea of moral licensing. So at that sense of, well, I'm recycling, therefore I'm doing my bit already. And that from a psychological perspective can get us into some misplaced ideas about the actual contributions we're making. And then again, there's some really good research to back this up, that actually we tend to overestimate, and I'm saying we, like really collectively, including me, overestimate the contributions that our green behaviours are actually making. So if you ask people in Wales about recycling, they'll do it, but they think they're done. They're all good now. So they can go to IKEA at the weekend and do whatever. Again, I'm not judging or blaming, I'm just saying that's how it is. So my concern is that if we say it's working, that's the status quo. But of course, when you say to somebody or people, it's not working, that's like, well, why isn't, who's to blame? It ends up being a bit of a blame game. So there were definite questions about how we would frame that this isn't quite working. And certainly research, again, has shown that those sort of feelings of well-being and community are often the hooks that can get people into doing different things, rather than necessarily about, do your bit and recycle or whatever. So I think we have to be honest, but we have to be very careful about how frank we're being, how we frame it.
Yeah, so please.
Yes, I was thinking you were speaking about this perception of our right to experience freedom through consumption, and how that's always been like that's our right. And there also, the project within the Trust, which is looking to think about transportation, and we speak also about citizens, not users or consumers. And we discuss also individual responsibilities. And I can see that when we look to, for example, transportation, I can see different strategies being used within shifting behavior to specific direction. For example, in Stockholm, public authorities are working a lot to kind of create conditions that everyone will still have right, for example, to purchase a car or have an individual car, but the conditions would kind of created in the way that they would not want to do that. While in the other countries like Germany, that I'm looking into, they do a bit differently, where they kind of sometimes have even legal written contract with, for example, new residents in the houses, where they kind of sign up that they would not buy new cars. And when I was speaking with Stockholm, so they were said that we don't want to do that. We don't think that we can take away the right of consuming, but we need to kind of work in different ways. So I was wondering, from your own experience, can you reflect a bit of those strategies, how they work? So like, so something in between the lines, because we a lot of times speak about the rights, the responsibilities, and then how that's in the context of sustainable consumption. Then.
So I don't quite get your particular question though. So
that's over here, like why countries use different strategies.
Oh, I see, right.
Can you like reflect on it?
Well, I mean, being here in Sweden, I think culturally you might, I don't know Sweden that well, but what British people, for example, will accept in terms of being told what to do is quite different from, say, having worked a bit in the Netherlands. There are social norms and forms of governance that do or don't work in particular contexts. Now, that's a big stereotype and that's a big generalization, but certainly the institutions and structures of acceptable levels of, the types of interventions really do differ across, say, the European Union. Like, for example, when I was doing my PhD back in the day, I was working with a charity called Global Action Plan. They first started in the Netherlands, and this is like 20 years ago. It was a model of streets, households in the streets working together to collectively bring down their waste generated by the households. And in the Netherlands, it was all very groups working together, and they were like weighing each other's waste and keeping collective diaries. When they tried to transpose that model to the UK, it did not work. It was like, no neighbours getting to know, look at my waste, like very much like back off kind of approach. And the whole model fell apart. And so Global Action Plan then had to make it an individual household model rather than a street model. That's just a small example of, I think, why these different forms of governance go down well and work. I mean, I don't know about Germany much at all. I've only been a few times, but there must be something there that enables people to accept that level of intervention that in a lot of places, like in, say, for the USA, for example, just they would not be willing to accept that. That's a very banal answer to a deep question, but I'm not sure. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm just, yes, exactly. Basically, I have that. How much is that context dependent, basically? I think all this one universal answer.
Yeah.
Ola, and then ask you.
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting talk. I had maybe like just a reflection on the previous comment and then two questions. The first one I was just thinking about in relation to sort of freedom and consumer sovereignty, where we can tell them what to do. And I'm just thinking, like, this is one understanding of liberalism and freedom that's quite new. I feel like you can also understand liberalism in a classical sense, that not to do harm to anyone else.
Yeah.
And I think it's just interesting, again, going back to what you were discussing here, what we see as hands off and what we cannot. I mean, thinking in Germany now, has been a discussion on speed limits on the Autobahn, where someone said this is an infringement on our liberty, on our freedom, while in other countries this is in Sweden, of course, we have that. So just kind of this, how we understand this freedom dimension. So I'm not sure what freedom would look like in a circular economy. Maybe that could be something to think about.
Yeah.
But then on to my questions, like this, you were already touching upon it, but this is how we address the policymakers. And of course, you brought up this well-being aspect, and you have Scotland, I think, and New Zealand and Iceland, that is well-being alliance. And I'm wondering if you see, is that like just another, is it more greenwashing again, or do we see something more transformational in that changing? That we should talk about well-being instead of growth and so on. And of course, well-being economy has a lot of overlap with sufficiency and ego. And then related to that, I was wondering if you would have any ideas of policies that either single ones or in combination that could be more like deep leverage points, to use the word of Meadows, in relation to foster a more circular economy?
Yeah, all very good questions. I know it sounds trite, but my mind goes back to the education system. I teach undergraduates who have come up through a time of where they learn about climate change, who are thoroughly de-skilled in terms of actually undertaking any practices. And maybe it's not the formal education system, but certainly I think we are doing a disservice to our young people to actually be resilient and know how to repair. I mean, I know some places do and that things are changing, but it doesn't sound like a deep leverage point, but I think it is, because it's asking, what is education for? And at the moment, education is for making us all well-behaved citizens with jobs who pay our taxes, which is, we're all happy to do because we live in nice countries. Well, yours is nicer than mine, but anyway, in terms of the social welfare state, anyway. So yeah, I think going back to fundamentally thinking, what are we actually trying? Who are we trying to produce? Who are the citizens we're producing? We're still producing good little workarounds, basically, rather than resilient citizens. So that would be one of my deep leverage points, which then has all kinds of ramifications onwards for the university system. Like, I'm in a university and I'm trying to get my own institution to make some, what I think is quite basic changes, and it's really, really hard. The institutional inertia built into large institutions is very problematic. Coming back to Wales again, sorry, I keep bringing back to it, but it's very interesting that we have a piece of legislation called the Future Generations Act, which you may have heard of, which basically says that public institutions have to evaluate their policy interventions through the potential well-being and sustainability implications for now and future generations. That could very easily be a whole lot of nonsense in terms of just greenwashing or well-being washing, as you suggest. So it's not that the phrase exists, it's what happens after that phrase exists. And we do actually have a well-being of future generations commissioner within the Welsh government, whose job is to work with the various departments to see that through in terms of, well, what does it mean for practice? How does it inform policy? How do we even count it? Like, what metrics are we using here? So I think obviously well-being, like any word, just can become meaningless in this iteration. At university, we get these emails every week about taking care of your well-being. You just think, well, come on, stop giving me so much work. Like, it's individualizing the responsibility for the workload that you're being given, which shouldn't be my responsibility. So yes, it can be like that. But I do think there's ways of actually leveraging it that is actually very interesting, and I think the Welsh government's doing a good job of that.
Okay, so now we're just a minute after 4, I think, but we'll take one last question from Eskil and then we round off. Yeah.
Yes. Well, in posing this question on how to get people to get along with this kind of transition and to reducing their consumption levels, you mentioned the super rich, and that it certainly doesn't help with their, I guess, flights and the yachts and so on, and the inequality which is entailed with that. But I also wanted to ask you and hear a bit about your reasoning on the upper middle classes and their role in this transition, both in perspective of them being seen many times in their practices as being the frontier with e-bikes or whatever it could be, but also their role in like a more cultural sense of setting the terms of what is dignified living in terms of fashion or anything like that, and how the role of this group and what it does in such a transition.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my mind, I'd want to separate out them as resource users and them as sort of cultural instigators. If that's the right word. When I talk about when I mentioned like the uber wealthy, I guess I'm kind of lumping in quite a lot of people who you might consider upper sort of middle class, because actually on a global scale, they're still probably in the top 10%. Like the richest people in Sweden will definitely be some of the richest people in the world in terms of people who have got everyday jobs, but they're barristers and they're earning significant amount of money. You could consider them globally pretty uber wealthy. But in terms of, see, coming back to the idea of them setting the tone and showing the example, I'm not convinced that that is necessarily how society works anymore. I don't think that the upper classes or the middle class are the icon setters that classic sociological theory might suggest they once were. I think there's a lot more that is, it's not bottom up at all, because it's very contrived from a manufacturing perspective about sort of, more street and very different types of perspective. There's almost like an anti middle class consumption that goes on as well, and an antipathy towards the people who are quite wealthy, which means you react in a way that you don't want to be like them. So I think putting them in any kind of position as leading the charge is problematic if we think that's going to then trickle down. But it's certainly right in terms of what it signals to people about why the heck should I do it when that person driving that huge BMW is driving that huge BMW. And it's whether we think that person inherently has the right to behave like that just because they happen to have been born into a family and had a good education and they were looked after and suddenly they've got a great job. So I think a lot of it is about how we perceive the distribution of fairness within society, which differs from person to person. Yeah, that was very rambling. But yeah, I mean, I'm not, well, certainly in my country, I think the middle classes have lost all credibility as trendsetters. They're actually rather more of sort of a receptacle for quite a lot of blame, really. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much, Kirsty, for this